Hello, and welcome once again to our study of Jamgon Mipham's Sword of Wisdom, the Nyingma approach to valid cognition. Now, just as always, kindly generate the intention to apply this in terms of our path to awakening, and awakening for the sake of all confused sentient beings that wander in samsara, unnecessarily suffering. This is what we'd like to accomplish. And in doing so, we need a very committed, complete engagement in this project. And that's where we need an appreciation that everything we're coming across in the Buddhist teaching is not founded on some Indian beliefs that would be irrelevant for us who might not be living in India or living in India in the what have we at the time of the Buddha and so forth. It's not something that's constructed by Tibetans, but what we have in the Buddhist teaching is an insight into the ground of our very being. And so we're approaching something that is universal. And what we also understand is this is not only universal in terms of our human experience. Consciousness is universal to all living entities. Like I recently, I think, quoted, there was something like 150 scientists, including some very venerable ones like Stephen Hawking, that signed a document that actually accepted something which has never really been clearly understood before or accepted before, that animals as well, any living entity actually possesses consciousness in the sense of wishing to be happy, wishing to be free from suffering. So there are different ways in which consciousness can be understood, but certainly that wish to be happy and to avoid suffering is universal to all beings. And this is indicative of Buddha nature. This is indicative of an intelligence that is not just sort of doesn't matter if there's this or that. There's a big difference between suffering and happiness. This is where we also differ from the structures that we might perceive as very sophisticated when we have computers or even artificial intelligence. A robot doesn't really care whether or not there is causes of suffering or happiness. We just worry about whether there's malfunction or not. But the actual experience, the dimension of experience, is what defines a sentient creature. And that's where sentient creatures everywhere wish for happiness, and unfortunately, not understanding this ground nature that is informing this wish for happiness, namely Buddha nature, not understanding that properly, sentient beings are perpetuating suffering. So what we're on to in terms of the path of awakening is addressing this universally, and that's where our complete engagement is required. And for us to be completely engaged in this, we need to appreciate how what we're doing with the study of valid cognition is understanding how this knowledge is universal. The ground, the epistemic grounds of Buddhism are universal. For example, when I, as a young boy, went to English school, we talked about shillings and pence, pounds, guineas, halfpenny farthings, things like that. And I think Australians would have done so too, somewhere until the mid-60s. And so that would have been, you could say, operating within its own language, very different from, say, the German mark system, und Pfennig, and so forth. And that's where, nevertheless, across these boundaries of different nations that stated their currency in various ways, then there would still be the universal fact of you have 1 and 1, you have two shillings, and you add another shilling, you have 3 shillings. Same with marks, same with crowns, same with rupees. So there's a science of mathematics that is universally appreciated. And that's where we would not say, well, in England, they believe that 2 shillings plus 1 shilling becomes 3 shilling. They wouldn't say that's a belief system. They would just use plain old mathematics to assess that. And similarly also, we wouldn't say people believe in mathematics. He's a mathematician because he believes in math. We can verify the validity of these of math and so forth. And similarly also, when it comes to everything that we're dealing with in Buddhism, we can validate that through our own observation. Of course, a lot of what we're talking about in the Buddhist teaching is something that is intangible in terms of the mind, but nevertheless, we can assert the validity of the Buddhist teaching through our critical thinking and investigating how this fits, whether it's objects out there in terms of 2 apples plus another apple makes 3 apples, or whether it's the mind through which we experience everything, where we can understand how there's a quality of the mind that can understand through direct observation, or we can understand through inference and so forth. So that's where it's not as if the teachings in the Buddhism just sort of come out because the good Lord Buddha said so and we say Amen, which would be fine. If my mechanic tells me, Jakob, do this and do that, I'll say yes. But if I were to investigate, I would gain confidence in my mechanic. And if we investigate the reasons why we assert what we do in the Buddhist teaching, we gain so much confidence, especially nowadays when we very often hear that Buddhism is seen as a religion. And for the modern person, very often religion is something about just believing and not asking questions. That's not the case with Buddhism. Buddhism is about asserting what we can immediately verify in terms of our own experience, our own observation. And so that's where the modern person has a lot of reason to have tremendous faith in the Buddhist teaching, because they're not being asked to just believe, but rather to investigate. So if you can hang in with that, then welcome. And that's what we're doing here to the best of our ability. Limitations lie to a large extent in the presenter, but I am determined that we'll make the best out of this. And to do so, particularly then, we invoke wisdom in the form of the teacher and the expounder of this particular teaching, namely the great Jakob Mipham Rinpoche, and we understand that his very nature goes beyond time and space and abides inseparably from our own wisdom nature. And as such, invoking the presence of Jakob Mipham Rinpoche is something that you could say brings about a particular condition within our own disposition that provides the conditions for fully understanding what we're seeking to study here. Through the blessing of awareness emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasures of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So presently in our study, we are on the topic of inference, and particularly how inference is applied. And last time we looked at how we understand reality on the basis of inference, in terms of understanding the actual nature of our reality. We can assess how, in fact, we can assess the nature of what we perceive on the basis of inference. For example, the lack of inherent existence. We might not be able to directly see the lack of inherent existence in phenomena, but we can infer that on the basis of things being dependently arisen. And this is something that we have all across the board in the Buddhist teaching. The very fact that phenomena arise in dependency, that their condition means that they lack inherent existence. So that's where we can understand the proposition that we have in the Buddhist teaching on the basis of inference. So this is the way that we can apply inference. Now we're going to look at one that I've had some again, as many times here, I've had some sort of quandary. How do you say? I've been somewhat in doubt whether I'm properly understanding the full implication of what's being said here, and have some questions as well. So I'm just sharing that with you. And in a way, this is very simple, and that's where there's this wonderful little note actually that comes with this particular verse from the translator, which is probably in oral communications about Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche when he was at this, or maybe I don't know if it was exactly at this, but the translator included this little story about. Let's just see if we have it here. Well, yes, no. Basically, it was while Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche was studying pramana, he had some doubts, and at one point, then and I think I mentioned this last time also, he was sort of frustrated, and then he had a dream in which Sakyapandita appeared to him. Sakyapandita being seen as the embodiment of Manjushri. We talk about 3 Manjushris in central Tibet. They are then Longchen Rabjam, Sakyapandita, and Je Tsongkhapa. So these 3 are viewed as Manjushri. So Mipham Rinpoche having this dream, being very auspicious in terms of understanding pramana, then Sakyapandita says to him, "What is it that's so difficult about pramana? It's just about affirmations and negations." Implying, how hard can it be? But that said, let's be fair to Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche and anybody who studied pramana. It is generally regarded as a tough subject. It's epistemology, it's logic. Anyway, on the basis of that dream, what the Sakyapandita then did is he took the Pramanavartika, the commentary on valid cognition from Dharmakirti. He took the volume and broke it in 2, and then stuck it together, and it became a sword. And he handed it to Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche, who then, at that point, Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche took the sword and waved it. And this sword, implying prajna, wisdom, then was, you could say, the auspicious condition for him never again having any doubt about pramana, about valid cognition. So that's where we could say it's understandable if we're sometimes sort of a little bit sort of how do you say, stumped, a little bit sort of puzzled with regards to some of what's being proposed here. Now, so here it says here, affirmations and negations. And let's just make this very clear again, like Sakyapandita, how hard can it be? We're really just talking about what is and what isn't. And we as sentient beings, we're deceived, right? When we think that there is something when in fact there's not. And we're deceived when we think that there's nothing when in fact there is something. So we talk about affirmations that we can assert, yes, this can be known about something, and we can also understand its qualities. So we can say there is a vase, but then we can also say there's no vase. So that's basically affirming and not affirming. But the moment that you say there's no vase, you're already generating a clear understanding about the condition of something. It's the same thing, you know, is my car in the garage? It's a big difference whether or not the car's there, right? So we talk about affirmations and negations as simply saying there is and there isn't. Now, about those things that there are, then you can say that my car is in the garage, but it's got a flat tire, or the battery's dead. Or we can talk about that there's not a car in the garage, but the motorbike is there. So that's where we can say an affirming negation in the sense that there is no, when we say is there any mode of transport and in the garage, and then we can say the car is not there, but that could still imply that there's something else which is there, in this case the motorbike. It's also like we say there's not a blue vase, but that implies that there could be something else, namely, for example, a yellow or red vase, and so forth. So in this way, we talk about things that there is, and also things that there aren't. And when we talk about things that there are, we can also talk about their qualities. For example, there's a blue vase. There's a vase, but we can say it's blue. It's got flowers in it. It's whatever it might be. So we can describe the qualities of that. So anyway, here it says, and this has to do then again with the sort of the universal nature of this. It says all the aspects that are established are encompassed by affirmation of their existence or what they are. All the aspects that are refuted are encompassed by negation, by showing their non-existence or what they are not. Now, I'm going to use the commentary a little today. It doesn't extend too much into sort of elaboration, so I'm going to be essentially drawing on that. And also, I found a little bit with regards to this verse here, I found a commentary by a great Khenpo that's operating out of Tibet, and who speaks very good Chinese, and as such also is somebody who has a great impact on Buddhism in China. His name is Khenpo Sodaje. There's generally, we talk about the two Khenpos from Larunga, Khenpo Tsultum Lodra and Khenpo Sodaje. And Khenpo Sodaje has then also taught on this. So, so I'm going to be using his commentary as well. In some way, this is very simple, but there's also some of the thing is, this is very sophisticated, and that's where we want to sort of at least attempt to get the subtlety of what's being said. So here, Khenpo Palden Sherp says, he says, in this world, all the myriad aspects that are established are encompassed by two types of affirmation. Now, when we say established in Buddhism, it just means that we assert as being a reality. So that's what we talk about, establish. So we have two types, an affirmation of their existence or an affirmation of what they are. Is there a vase? And how is this vase? All the myriad aspects that are refuted are encompassed by two kinds of negation, a negation of their existence or a negation of what they are. There is no vase, or it's not a blue vase. So so there's some overlap there in terms of the category, the second category of what we sometimes refer to as the affirmative negation. Anyway, we'll have a look at that. So the commentary here. Yeah, let me just sort of highlight again what it is, just since I got a bit fed up with the Kindle not working to my satisfaction, so I've actually cut and pasted the notes into a doc. So, okay, so we're talking about an appearing affirmation and what's called an excluding affirmation, an existential negation, and a predicate negation. And these two are quite similar. An appearing affirmation is there is a vase. There's a vase there. An excluding affirmation is that it's not a blue vase, right? So then we can assert it's another kind of vase. What I don't get, and this is just between you and me, don't tell anyone, I don't get why it has to be under affirmations, why we would understand it in terms of an excluding affirmation. Why can't we use just an affirmation in terms of its qualities? Why not say right away, it's a red vase? We could say there's a vase and there's a red vase, but anyway, that's just something that's lingering in my mind. Question. The other one is then the existential negation, again, that there is no vase, and that's again where we have a predicate negation, which is not saying that there's no vase, but simply just saying there's not a red vase. You know, and then you can think, well, there must be something else. But that works fine with negations, and we have that all the time. Like I also said, the car's not there, but then again, there's the motorbike. So in that sense, negations can sometimes imply that there's something else, you know. There's nobody here, that's different from saying June is not here. Now, June is maybe not here, but then again, there's Jane or there's Paul. So in that sense, we can just saying June is not here doesn't mean that there's nobody here. So that's what we call a predicate negation. So then here, then the commentary runs, like it continues, as has been said. This here, don't let this trip you up, but this is a little bit sometimes where there's an excessive, a rich use of double negations, excluding everything other than functional things, eliminate non-functional things. And that's basically saying when we don't have a thing, when we don't have everything that's not the thing remains, put it that way. So that's where we would say, for example, there's a cow. So when we say there's a cow, it eliminates everything that's not cow. It's implying that it's not a horse and so forth. Anyway, it says here, this refers to affirmations, and it's two classifications based on appearing and non-appearing objects. So simply just appearing and non-appearing objects refers to here. Functional things are connected with appearing objects and appearing affirmations. Non-functional things are connected with non-appearing objects and excluding affirmations. For example, we talk about the emptiness of something. So that's why that when we say June is not here, that implies that there's something else here. But there's no visible June, but it does actually tell us something about the situation of gives an idea of who's here in terms of just knowing who's not here. Somebody is here. So an affirmation is defined as that which is detected by the mind. It has, okay, so we see the vase, we see Jane and Paul. It has two categories, the appearing affirmation and the excluding affirmation. The definition of an appearing affirmation is that which is detected by a non-conceptual consciousness, meaning just seeing Jane and Paul, the vase, and is illustrated by any specific thing that is an apparent object. The definition of an excluding affirmation is an imputation that is detected by a conceptual mind, and it is illustrated by the elimination of another existence. So if you were expecting a meeting with 4 people, yourself, Paul, Jane, and June is missing, well, that is, you could say, something that is known in terms of there's something happening, yet there's also there's an elimination of something that you could say occupies a reality. Or yeah, an example of an excluding affirmation is this vase is not a red vase. The definition of a negation is that which is excluded by the mind. It has 2 categories. Basically means there's not. Yeah, we just say there's not, whatever. But not can mean many things, or 2 things basically. It has 2 categories. The existential negation, there is no vase, and the predicate negation, there's not a blue vase. There is something. The definition of an existential negation is that which is merely excluded by the conceptual mind. It excludes the presence of something. So that's where we just say there's not a vase. There's what here? There's not a horse. What's that? 81. Yeah. So he says the Tibetan word for an existential negation is mengak. This term is also translated as a non-implicative or non-affirming negation, because when something's existence is negated, nothing further is implicated. For example, there is no horse. At that time, we're not saying there's no red horse. We're just saying there's no horse, period. If you say there's not a red horse, there could very well be a white or a black horse. So this we have when we're just, we have that. And this is also something that comes up a lot in our understanding of the nature of reality. If, for example, we say emptiness, then there's some people who would say, well, emptiness means that there's nothing whatsoever. But others would say emptiness just means there's an absence of confusion and the reality that we attribute to certain objects is absent, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. So that's where sometimes in the teachings on Madhyamika, on the teachings on wisdom and so forth, there's a little bit of a difference with how we understand emptiness. Are we just saying that there's nothing, or are we saying there's an absence of confused phenomena? It doesn't mean there's not the presence of non-confused phenomena. For example, the qualities of enlightenment. So that's where you can say it's not as if somebody who's enlightened, who has realized emptiness, knows that there's nothing whatsoever. There's some discussion around that would sort of go along the lines as emptiness just meaning there's nothing. But others would say emptiness really just means that there's a lack of the solidity that we sometimes think about. But that doesn't exclude that there is all the qualities of enlightenment: strength, compassion, and wisdom. This is an important point. But there's a little bit of discussion around that, which is very stimulating and healthy in terms of just getting us to appreciate what is the implication. So that's what we call a non-affirmative negation. Okay? Non-affirmative, meaning there is no. Now, then you have is that which is merely excluded by the conceptual mind. It excludes the presence of something. The term existential negation has the same meaning as the term mere exclusion. Now, in an existential negation, nothing is left behind after the aspect has been negated, right? No horse. The definition of a predicate negation, and please, this is not at all sort of nerdy or irrelevant. This is actually something that has a lot of, you could say, value. The Tibetan word for predicate negation is maingak. This term is also translated as implicative negation or affirming negation, because when one aspect is negated, there is an implication of something else. For example, this is not a horse. No, this is not a horse, this is Paul, or this is our goat, or whatever it might be. So that's where there's just saying that this is not a horse, it implies that there is something. It's just not a horse. Okay. So there's various ways, or these two ways in which we can negate, saying there's nothing, or there's not what we thought there was, or it's not something, there's not something other than, anyway, you get it, right? Okay. So in a predicate negation, or a negation of what something is not, and that's it, that's really, it's a negation of what something is not, but doesn't mean that there isn't something, right? After some aspect has been negated, there is a suggestion of something else. Suggests something else. This is not a horse, but might be, you know, a large dog or something. The term predicate negation has the same meaning as the term excluding affirmation. Okay, we're all good. Excluding affirmation is often used in medical diagnosis. Yes, it's cancer, but not these types. So yes, you don't have cancer of whatever it might be. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you don't have cancer of this, but you might have cancer of another, and so forth. Yes. I'm going to take you to Khenpo Soraje's commentary, just because I like the guy. I haven't actually met him. Well, his colleague Khenpo Tsulten Lodro was visited Australia some years ago, and he was such a delightful presence. I saw him at the University of Queensland up in Brisbane, and it was such a lively discussion. He was so good at engaging the audience, so clear and so intelligent, so wonderful, wonderful teacher. And Khenpo Soraje also here in his presentation here, I think does a marvelous job. So verse 39, So he translates it slightly different, but again, all types of establishment, meaning all types of things that we assert as realities, summarized as proofs of existing and being. Now, being here, I would say, I wonder about the translator there. I would say, yeah, being, but rather the qualities of being. So we're more talking about not just the thing itself, but more what defines it. But okay, being. All types of negation condense into negation of existence and being. As for the views concerning the knowable objects of the world, their establishment can be of two types: proofs of something's existence and proofs of something's being. In contrast, the negations of all views can be summarized into non-existence and non-being. First of all, when we establish a view or affirm something, it must be either through its being, namely through the phrase "it is," or through its existence, right? So there is a horse. Aside from these two, there is no other mode of affirmation or establishment. There's a horse, there's not a horse. Simple as that. We're just talking horse. So that's where there is one or there's not. For example, we say there is fire on the mountain because there's smoke. Accordingly, this reasoning by the effect establishes that there is fire, namely the existence of fire. On the other hand, when we say the pillar is impermanent because it is created, and this reasoning by nature and terms establishes the entity of the pillar is impermanent. So that's where, on the basis of having something, we can nevertheless develop a conceptual idea of what it is and what it isn't in terms of its quality. So there's a pillar, but now we're saying more about the pillar than just the pillar. Just like we have the vase, that we can say more about it than just the vase, that it's red or that it's blue. And we have an image then, blue or red. And here also the pillar is impermanent because it is created. That's again, the first one is just seeing, is there a pillar or is there a fire? That's the existence of something. But then its nature or its quality, that's where we say it is impermanent. And then because it is created, that's where we use some reasoning. Secondly, all types of negation or refutation are performed by either non-being, namely through the phrase it is not a horse, or non-existence, namely by saying there is not. Likewise, there is no other mode of negation aside from these two. So, for example, we say there is no bottle before my eyes because it was not seen by my direct perception. Or we say a cow is not a bottle because it does not possess the particular characteristics of a bottle. Therefore, regardless of whether we engage negation through direct perception or through inference, negation has to be performed by positing non-existence or non-being, or absence of particular qualities in that thing. And these two modes encompass all possible meanings of negation. To translate this into Buddhist terms, we call negations of existence all negations that take the phrase there is not, while we call negation of being by all negations that take into the phrase it is not. So one says there's not somebody in there, there's nobody in the room, whereas we could say there's not a Danish person in that room. That's so that's where we would say there's an implication. There might be somebody else, just not a Dane, right? Okay, let's see. Oh, is the sound okay? Somebody is saying the connection is frozen, there's no sound. Connection back, good. Did I fall out? Did somebody, was it just, yeah, maybe just, I think, might just have you been your computer. That happens. So anyway, here we are. Proof statements and refutations. Okay, this is a good one also, because this is, again, how do we use inference? Well, we use it in terms of our own understanding, but it could also, out of compassion, be used when we're talking to somebody else. You know, that's where we can say, somebody says, I'm going to town, and then he says, well, the car's not there. So, or you say, you know, Jane took the car. So that's where we can use reasoning, or we can simply just say there is something, but we're essentially conveying insight to somebody else. This is on a very mundane level, but there's also, you could say, the views that, you know, some kid might think, oh, you know, sniffing paint thinner is really great. You know, I feel fabulous if I sniff paint thinner. And then that's where you could maybe say, well, paint thinner is dangerous because it's toxic to the body, right? So that's where we can use what we call a syllogism. Paint thinner is dangerous, that's it, dangerous, because it harms the body. So that's where you're using reasoning. Paint thinner harms the body. And that's where you can then make the proposition that is dangerous. You don't want to do it. So that's these three aspects of valid cognition. You could say in paint thinner, there's nothing healthy about paint thinner. There's both the forward and reverse pervasion. But that's where this kind of reasoning enables others. That's where the kid might go, oh, really? It's harming my body? It's not good for me, you mean? So that's where, and this of course also applies then to what we could call right and wrong views, you know, that if somebody wouldn't, for example, would say, you know, it doesn't matter what I do, you know, well, it has an impact, you know, doesn't matter if I cheat or steal or lie, then, you know, but we would say, well, this is something, you don't, lying is harmful because it will bring future suffering. Yeah. So that's where there's the understanding of what is something that's non-virtuous. And also, of course, we can also take this into a deeper level, philosophical understanding of how phenomena, you know, attachment to impermanent things brings suffering, or rather attachment to objects, attachment to composite objects brings suffering because they are compounded and impermanent, stuff like that. So that's where we can use inference in communicating to others. Again, this is not just about Buddhism. This is also if you're a lawyer or if you want to make a point to any other person, preventing them from sniffing paint thinner or preventing them to unnecessarily think they could do something going to town when there's no car, or you know, deeper issues. All this is using, you could say, just reasoning universally. So this is very good in terms of just our own capacity to communicate effectively. So it says, third, for the two ways of presenting inference in relation to how it is used in the root text. Okay, what was it again? Let me just see here, the notes, 83. The two ways of preventing inference in relation to how it is used through proofs and refutations. Okay. Having gained certainty about the way of using affirmations and negations based on valid cognition, one can then show others proofs and refutations according to reasoning. In formulating refutations, one uses reasons with the three criteria for valid evidence to establish autonomous arguments, and one refutes others by showing the consequence depending on what they assert. So that's where we now will take that understanding of what there is and what there isn't and use this to others. So this is where we would say inferential logic can be used for oneself. It's something that we use personally to gain an understanding of things, and it's also what we then use in the case of communicating effectively to others with regards to what is true. And the more we actually investigate things, the more we approach the nature of things. So that always applies. So that's where we can use then these three criteria for valid evidence. you could say, composite phenomena are impermanent, because rather phenomena like sound are impermanent because they're composite. And that's where, or sniffing paint thinner is dangerous because it's harmful to the body, right? So that's where we have these three criteria for valid evidence: the proposition, the reason, and the pervasion. Now, when we're doing that, then we're making a statement about something. Something is dangerous or something is impermanent. But that's something we do because there might be the lack of awareness in the others. They might think, oh, paint thinner is wonderful, or this will last forever, and so forth. So that's, or simply just that you'll end up miserable. That's actually, the first one was the arguments. The second is the consequences, you know. Okay, let me show you Harry. He's been sniffing paint thinner for 6 months now, and then you have some kid that's completely wrecked, right? Or you see the unhappiness that comes about when individuals, they lack insight into the nature of things, you know. Get rich schemes, you know, a pyramid scheme. Yes, I'm going to get rich. And then you show, well, you know, Jones next door, he tapped onto a pyramid scheme, and look what that got him. Then Jones is completely ruined, or, you know, broke or whatever, right? So that's where we could show the consequences. But all these are essentially reasons that you could say compassionately engage with others. Okay, good. So generally speaking, in relation to whatever we want to comprehend, we begin by relying on authentic, valid cognition. So that's us wanting to understand the nature of emptiness or the nature of wisdom and so forth, right? To understand the nature of Dharma, we begin to approach it in order to understand it. To do so, we use unmistaken direct perception for objects and that are not obscured, and inference for objects that are obscured. This just means things that we can see. That's where we can say we have direct perceptions of objects with our consciousness without necessarily that requiring any thinking. I can see a lamp, I can see a window, and so forth. But then again, then there is the inference. There's, I can hear bird sounds, for example. I can't see them, but hearing the bird sounds, that infers that there are birds out there, even though they're hidden to me. Let's just see, let's just with the notes, 84, okay. Unobscured is another way of saying manifest phenomena, and obscured is another way of saying hidden phenomena. So manifest phenomena is the lamp that I can see, obscured are the birds that I can't see, but I can infer that they're there on the basis of the sound. Certainty is gained by using inference for one's own sake. Okay. In Dharmakirti's texts on valid cognition, he divides the discussion on inference into inference for oneself and inference for others. One must gain certainty through inference for oneself before showing inference to others. And that is where we first need to be clear on the nature of things. For example, if we're studying the Buddhist teaching, then we need to be sure, if we're going to, for us to actually understand things that are not that easy, for example, emptiness, then there needs to actually be a process in which we think, oh yeah, what does it actually imply? Ah, that's what it implies. And then we can communicate it to others. So that's where we need to first gain certainty through inference for oneself before we begin to show it to others. So certainty is gained by using inference for one's own sake, which involves valid proofs that affirm what is reasonable and negate what is unreasonable. So that's where we can say, ah, yeah, phenomena, they arise in dependency, hence they're empty, and to believe that phenomena last is unreasonable. So the commentary runs, then for those who challenge one's position because they do not realize the nature of what is being comprehended, or they have wrong ideas, yeah, simply just uninformed, paint thinner, what's the fastest way to the nearest town, then it's important that you actually have some idea and you can show them. One responds by showing them the facts that one has seen in accordance with authentic reasoning. It is necessary to establish one's own position in a clear and reasonable way. And after that, one criticizes and refutes others' positions by showing how it's unreasonable. So that's as simple as just showing that paint thinner is unhealthy, or that if you take the long way, that's it's gonna take twice as long to get there. And likewise also to believe that phenomena are permanent, lasting, so forth, is unreasonable. And that's where, if we've thought about it, then we can show to others that this just doesn't hold. So the discourse on valid cognition states, inference for the sake of others clearly presents the facts one has seen for oneself. So that's where we use inference then to essentially tap into other people's ability to reason. The essence of reasoning states, inference for the sake of others is expressed through logical signs having the three criteria for valid evidence, because effects are designated in relation to their causes. Inference for others uses syllogisms and two classes of phenomena. Phenomena that are similar to the subject of the syllogism, and phenomena that are dissimilar to the subject of the syllogism. So this is where we go into a little bit what we've touched on before, which are the correct and false proof statements, which again, yeah, they're a little bit sort of finicky and subtle, but they're also valid. And that's where, if you are a lawyer or if you are involved in debate, you're going to be continually operating with these. I don't do that so much, even though I can get rather opinionated and argumentative. And if I really wanted to succeed, then I should really get this down, but we will look at it. And I think it's something that most of us will sort of nod in recognition when we see it. Okay, I normally stop here around, actually I normally stop a bit earlier, just to invite questions and answers. So, or rather invite questions and see if there's any answers. What now? Gosh. Hello. Okay, good. So, so if you have some questions, please go ahead. So much postmodernist deconstruction can't be good for the psyche. That's right. It very often leads to a very sort of nihilist view, right? It's seen as a liberation, but in fact, very often we end up with a very bleak voidness. Sometimes I think discussing things in such detail might be a barrier to non-academics understanding what should have been relatively simple messages given the time they were giving. Am I oversimplifying Buddhism? Well, it's the same thing like me and my mechanic, my mechanic will just say, this is how you drive. But if I begin to ask questions, then he'll give me a detailed answer. So likewise, if someone is taught that phenomena don't have any real existence and simply just settle into the non-thought in which there's no duality and objectification, then fine. But in case you do identify how you do inevitably solidify the notion of self and solidify the notion of other, then it's quite helpful to have some teaching on the lack of inherent existence. And that's also similarly also, if you send your teenager to Paris, your very wealthy teenager who's just inherited $10 million, send them to Paris, then you'd probably also give them some good advice about, how to spend the money. So that's where we do have, you could say there's a very simple message, which is, just be sensible, or you could say, just rest the mind in free from conceptual constructions. And for some people it would work. We could say the nature of the mind is essentially clear and good. But for most of us, we come with, you know, more or less we're aware of that we come with a fair bit of complications, and that's where it's important to actually be able to identify what it is that we want to eliminate. But you know, what's the problem a little bit with like we were talking about post-modernity is that it comes from a place in which it's rejecting some you could say flawed assumptions, but it also throws the baby out with the bathwater and coming up with, you could say, just an absence, a complete absence. It's interesting that someone like Jacques Derrida, who is famous for being sort of one of the great fathers or whatever, very influential in terms of postmodernity and deconstruction, he himself identified the problem with that and was very interested in God. I've just recently been looking at something that Derrida was writing, and he himself actually identified the need for God, and himself actually had a relationship, a religious bent. So yes, definitely postmodernism can be, and that's so often what permeates our sort of the arts and the literatures and media and so forth. There's this sort of assumption about, well, you know, there's no truth. That's very unfortunate. Lack of insight into the nature of things we suffer, but with having to do mega daily tasks, how can you find decent headspace, compassion? You know, everything that we might be deconstructing things in terms of not being naive about things, but it doesn't mean that we're not situated within a very real world. And our wisdom, which we could say this informs to a large extent the nature of meditation, really plays into post-meditation with a greater degree of openness and kindness. And so in terms of our everyday life, to have a decent headspace, if that's the, you know, what's the flavor, what's the mood, compassion, openness of mind, tolerance, caring, and so forth, because that's where we're already beginning to, you say, dismantle the rigidity around the ways that we interact with our world. But of course, compassion is also informed very much by us beginning to dismantle the sort of assumptions, the rigid assumptions around our reality. And that's where we also begin to dismantle sort of the idea of self and the idea of the ways in which we sort of, sometimes it's almost like a political statement, you know, I have a right to be here, you know, and all of that. And that's where we become very rigid about self, right? And that's where just beginning to just sort of little bit sort of question some of our assumptions around things like self and all of these things can be quite helpful. They're not entirely sort of, you could say, divorced from our experience. It seems similar to one sutra I learned recently, Sutra of Three Kayas. Is it true that Dharmakaya can only be seen by Buddha? Sambhogakaya can be seen by Bodhisattva? We ordinaries only see Nyamanakaya. Is that relevant? That's true. But at the same time, what we do in Mahayana Buddhism, even though we can't see the Dharmakaya, we can assert its ontological status. We can assert its reality. We can establish that phenomena are without inherent existence through inference. And that's where we can understand Dharmakaya. Even though we don't see it, we can infer it. So even though we might not have the experience as such, we can infer the reality of it. So, for example, we sometimes have sort of a visceral experience. Somebody talks about certain conditions in a very cold place. We can almost have a visceral experience of that because we can see, yes, the truth of, being outside in the cold and so forth. Then we can understand logically how that is, and so we can assert that reality. And so similarly, also, I don't know if that's a good example, but anyway, Dharmakaya, the absence of self in person and in phenomena, the experience of that we might not have, but we can understand how phenomena, they don't possess any inherent existence. So that's understanding, is the intangible nature of the essence of phenomena, which when it's realized is the Dharmakaya. And we can also understand how within that lack of obscuration, that lack of limitation that the ordinary obscured self-centered mind with all its kleshas and karma, in the absence of that, then the mind is released with countless qualities such as strength, compassion, and wisdom. And that's where we can appreciate the Sambhogakaya. Even though we don't see the Sambhogakaya, we can nevertheless, we can understand how that is what arises. And finally, and so of course Nirmanakaya is what we experience in terms of all our perceptions. But it's also important to understand that in the sutra teachings, we see these, we understand these as something that we could realize in the future. That's generally the notion of the gradual sutra path. Whereas in the Vajrayana, there's the understanding that this being the ontological nature of, this is the nature of things, this is the reality of things, we abide by it. And we actually receive empowerment to already now acknowledge that we possess the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. We possess all these qualities. And that's why in the resultant vehicle of the Vajrayana, there's a lot of references to the Dharmakaya and Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya as being spontaneously present. So even though we might not fully have realized it, this is what we actually are. And so the sutra teaching says, you might realize this one day, but the Vajrayana teaching says, yes, the reason why you might realize it one day is because you already possess this nature potentially. So you just need to acknowledge it. Okay. Whoa, long question there. I'm not sure this is relevant. So ignore if you wish. Well, you've written a lot, so it'd be a shame to ignore it. I see great suffering in animals. I shop at the store which sells live creatures, crabs, lobsters, etc. Today I saw the last remaining lobster. It was so scared. My question, if this is my own projection, it doesn't say much about me. Are these animals really there? This is all my guru's mind speech. The hunters become hunted. You're thinking of something we call solipsism. And that would be the idea that there's nothing but me in this universe. So when we say everything is my projection, we're not saying that we're alone in the universe. We're just saying the way that we see that lobster comes from ourselves. We have our own particular, we call it projection, but it's you could say it's more, it's more according to our disposition. And you, for example, see the lobster and your heart goes out to it. If you're a restaurant owner, you say, oh, that's, that's $20 profit there. Or if you're somebody who loves to eat lobsters, you think, that looks like dinner. So that's where we say, when we say projections, we're not saying that there's nothing there, or it's all I'm alone here. I'm just seeing everything, just like in a dream where we're dreaming everything and it's just all made up in our mind. We are saying that we construct everything on the basis of the optics that we're wearing. So that's where you might have blue glasses and I might have red glasses. So we're seeing things as blue and red, and that's our particular version and entrance to the reality. The lobster also, it looks out at you and sees a kind human face and maybe feels your compassion. So that also has its own experience. So we're all having various experiences, but the lobster next to, if there was another lobster next to them, might have looked at you and worried that maybe you were somebody who was there to eat it, and so forth. So you can understand we all come with, and that's why we call it relative truth, because we're all coming with our own particular optics, our own particular projections. So I'll just read a little bit more. Very good question. This is all my guru's mind, speech, etc. So when we begin to meditate on the guru's body, speech, and mind, this is where we are no longer just held by our ordinary kleshas and karma, but in blending our mind with the wisdom of the teacher, we begin to take on the guru, or we begin to take off the glasses, and we begin to have the guru's much more open relationship to the phenomenal world. And that's where we're seeing everything in terms of being the magical display, yes, of our, when it's our ordinary projections, karmic projections, our confused projection, when you mix with the co-emergent wisdom of the guru's mind, that's where then there's a freedom from that, and that's where phenomena are seen in a greater way. They're seen as the display of deity, mantra, and wisdom, or the guru's body, speech, and mind. So that's where there is a dimension of vipassana that takes place the moment that we mingle with the co-emergent wisdom of the guru. The hunters become the hunted. Karma. Yes, that's right. Yes, hunters would then generate a particular karmic experience. I go by saying names of Buddhas and Om Mani Padme Hum into their tanks. Very good. Very good for the lobster. There's more to my question, confusion, but perhaps you'll understand what I'm getting at. Multifaceted question. Well, I think a very good question and relevant for what we're doing here. So thank you for that. Okay. So I hope this was useful. No, all the questions that come in here, they're so valid, and it's very important to question. So we should never ever hold back and think, oh, it's maybe disrespectful to the teaching if I'm seeing a flaw in the teaching, or I'm seeing something I don't understand. I shouldn't mention it. No, we should, because the teaching, this is just like, again, if I go to my mechanic and there's something that I don't understand about my car, and he can explain it to me. So that's where then I sort of, get it. So we always say doubt is the gateway to faith. So important to doubt and to question, because the nature of the Dharma is such that it can stand up to analysis. It can handle it. And in fact, when we have doubts and we don't ask questions, then we stay with that limitation and reservation. When we ask a question and we get it cleared up, then it generates so much confidence in the subject matter. So please never see the questions that pop up as the products of muddled brain. Not at all. Nobody's muddled. We're all on the path, and we should acknowledge what we're thinking, respect what we're thinking, and respect our doubts. And like the Buddha said, you should not accept my teaching out of respect for my person, but on the basis of your own inquiry. Yeah. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.